People love to imagine the fall of Rome as a story of violence. Barbarians storming the gates, legions collapsing, poisoned emperors and burning cities. But what if the real enemy wasn't outside those gates? What if it was inside, quietly eating the empire alive? Because Rome didn't collapse overnight. It rotted slowly from within. And one of the most powerful forces behind that decay was money. At its height, Rome controlled continents. Its armies ruled the world, its cities glittered with wealth. But running an empire that size came at a cost, one that even the Caesars couldn't afford forever. The real downfall didn't begin with swords or spears. It began with coins that looked the same, but were worth less and less. And once the trust in Rome's money disappeared, the empire's foundations began to crumble. So how exactly did Rome destroy itself through its own currency? Let's go back to where it all started, with a coin that once held an empire together. At the center of Rome's power was a small silver coin called the denarius. First minted around 211 years before Christ, it wasn't just currency. It was confidence in metal form. Nearly pure silver, trusted everywhere from the streets of Rome to distant provinces. Soldiers were paid in it. Merchants demanded it. Ordinary citizens saved it as proof of stability and strength. The denarius symbolized the empire's promise that Rome's word, like its metal, was solid. As long as people believed in Rome, they believed in its money. It was more than an economy. It was a relationship of trust between the people and their rulers. But empires never stopped growing, and with every new conquest came new expenses. More borders to defend, more legions to feed, more monuments to build, and soon that beautiful silver coin would become the empire's greatest weakness. Because when Rome couldn't afford its ambitions anymore, it didn't cut spending. It started cutting the silver. By the 2nd century after Christ, the Roman Empire had reached its breaking point. The borders stretched thousands of miles, from Britain to Egypt, from Spain to Mesopotamia. Defending that massive territory cost a fortune. Armies had to be paid, roads repaired, aqueducts maintained, and new wars constantly funded. But tax revenues weren't keeping up. So emperors turned to an old and dangerous trick: debasement. Instead of raising taxes, which risked angering citizens, they quietly reduced the silver inside each coin. On the surface, it looked like nothing had changed. The denarius still carried the emperor's face and Rome's proud symbols. But underneath, the metal told a different story. Under Emperor Augustus, the denarius was about 95% silver. By the time of Caracalla in the early 3rd century, it was around half. And under Gallienus, barely 5%. A once solid coin had become a bronze disc with a thin silver coating. The people weren't fools. They could feel the difference. Traders started charging more for the same goods. Soldiers demanded higher pay to cover rising costs. And the economy began to spin out of control. What started as a quiet trick had become a public disaster. The money no longer meant what it once did, and Rome's faith in itself began to fade. As the silver disappeared from Rome's coins, so did the trust that held the empire together. Prices began to climb faster than anyone could keep up. A measure of wheat that once cost a single denarius soon cost dozens. The same coin that once fed a family could barely buy a loaf of bread. Ordinary Romans felt it first. Merchants stopped accepting the debased coins and turned to barter or demanded gold instead. Farmers refused to sell their crops for worthless money. Local markets fell apart, and people returned to trading goods directly, like a civilization moving backward. The government tried to fix it by minting even more coins, hoping that quantity could replace quality, but every new batch of money only made things worse. The more coins Rome struck, the less they were worth. Inflation became unstoppable. Soon, the army, the very backbone of the empire, began to lose faith. Soldiers who had once fought for glory now fought for higher pay just to survive. Some even turned on their commanders or sold their loyalty to rival generals who could promise better payment. Rome's currency wasn't just losing value, it was tearing apart the fabric of loyalty that kept the empire alive. But the worst was yet to come. Because when money collapses, power follows. And soon, Rome would find itself caught in a storm that nearly wiped it off the map. Between the years 235 and 284 after Christ, the Roman Empire descended into chaos. Historians call it the crisis of the 3rd century, and it was exactly that. A half-century of invasions, plagues, and civil wars that shattered everything Rome had built. Emperors rose and fell like dominoes. Some ruled for years, others for months. Assassinations became routine, and behind all the blood and betrayal was one simple truth. Rome's economy was broken. Taxes were demanded in coins that no longer held value. Farmers abandoned their land rather than pay. Trade networks collapsed as merchants refused worthless money. Cities starved while the countryside emptied. The government tried desperate measures to keep order. Emperors forced citizens to work in certain trades. They introduced price controls to stop inflation, but nothing worked. In 301 after Christ, Emperor Diocletian tried one last move, the edict on maximum prices. He set fixed prices for more than 1,000 goods and services, from bread to wages. Violators could be executed. But no law can make a broken coin whole. Markets went black, trade stopped, and the empire's last economic pulse began to fade. Rome had reached a point where faith in money was gone, and once that faith is gone, no power can bring it back. Yet even in this darkness, one emperor would try to rebuild what was lost. And his solution would change the empire's money and its fate forever. When Constantine the Great came to power in the early 4th century, Rome was a shadow of its former self. The old silver coins were worthless, the economy was fractured, and trust in government money had vanished. If Rome was to survive, it needed more than a new emperor. It needed new money. So Constantine introduced the solidus, a gold coin with consistent purity and weight. For the first time in decades, people could hold a coin that felt real again. The solidus restored some confidence, especially in the Eastern Empire, where it would last for centuries as a stable currency. But in the West, it was already too late. The damage done by centuries of debasement couldn't be undone. The army was weak, trade networks broken, and the public's trust destroyed. The gold coin might have been pure, but the foundation it stood on was already rotten. Rome's power had depended on the faith of its people, and when that faith in its money vanished, the empire's heart went with it. Constantine's reforms slowed the fall, but they couldn't stop the inevitable. The empire that once ruled the world had learned too late that when money dies, empires follow. But Rome's story didn't end there. Its mistakes would echo across history, repeated by nations that thought they were smarter than the past. Rome's collapse wasn't unique. It was just the first warning, the first empire to learn what happens when a government destroys trust in its own money. Centuries later, the same story played out again. After World War I, Germany was drowning in debt from war reparations. The government printed marks to pay its bills, believing it could paper over the problem. At first it worked, then it exploded. By 1923, prices were doubling almost every day. A loaf of bread that once cost 1 mark suddenly cost hundreds of billions. People carried their wages home in wheelbarrows. Life savings evaporated overnight. And out of that economic ruin came anger, extremism, and a new kind of darkness. Zimbabwe followed the same pattern in the early 2000s. The government printed money to cover collapsing production and rising debt. By 2008, inflation had reached levels so absurd that prices doubled every 24 hours. Shops stopped updating their tags because it no longer mattered. The national currency became worthless, and people were forced to use foreign money just to survive. Different centuries, different continents, same mistake. Each time, leaders believed they could cheat reality. Each time, the people paid the price. But this story doesn't just belong to history books. It's still unfolding right now, just in a slower, quieter form. Fast forward to 1971. President Richard Nixon stands before the world and announces that the United States is cutting its final tie to gold. From that moment, the dollar became a fiat currency, backed not by metal, but by trust in government. It was the modern version of Rome's silver coin turned bronze. The money still looked the same. The coins and bills still carried familiar faces. But the value was no longer anchored to anything real. Over the next decades, debt ballooned and money supply exploded. Governments learned they could spend without limits, print without consequence, and call it growth. Inflation became a permanent feature of life. The cost of living rose while the value of savings quietly fell. $1 in 1971 could buy what now takes more than 6. The trick is subtle but deadly. Citizens are told that higher wages mean progress, but prices rise faster. They're told that debt drives investment, even when it only fuels consumption. Stock markets hit record highs, yet most people own no shares. The illusion of wealth hides the erosion of value. Just like Rome, modern economies pretend that nothing fundamental has changed. But behind the printed paper and digital numbers, the same decay is spreading. And this time, it's global. The next collapse won't be confined to a single empire. When trust in modern money breaks, it will ripple through the entire world. Rome's story isn't just ancient history, it's a mirror. It shows what happens when a civilization forgets that money is built on trust, not tricks. The first lesson is simple. Inflation is never an accident. It's a policy, a silent tax that slowly transfers wealth from the people to those in power. Every time a government prints more money, it's quietly taking value from what you already own. The second lesson is about real wealth. True value doesn't exist in printed paper or digits on a screen. It lives in things that hold meaning when money fails: land, skills, productive work, and resources. Those are the assets that survive when currencies collapse. The third lesson is humility. Never assume stability is permanent. Romans in the first century would have laughed if someone told them their coins would one day be worthless. Germans in 1913 would have laughed at the idea of wheelbarrows filled with cash. Zimbabweans in the 1980s thought independence meant security. But history has a pattern, and it's ruthless to those who ignore it. The fall of Rome teaches that when trust in money breaks, everything else begins to unravel. Contracts fail, trade stops, governments lose authority, armies dissolve, society turns against itself. And the final blow never comes from the outside, it comes from the treasury within. When people talk about the fall of Rome, they picture the barbarians, the wild invaders at the gates. But the truth is, Rome's real killer wore no armor and carried no sword. It sat inside marble halls, minting coins that looked like wealth but carried nothing inside. The empire didn't die in a single battle. It bled out slowly through the veins of its own economy. Each new coin struck with less silver, each promise backed by less truth. By the time the barbarians arrived, the empire had already fallen in spirit. And that's the warning history gives us. The destruction of money is always the destruction of trust, and once trust is gone, no nation stands for long. The Romans thought they could outsmart the system. So did the Germans of the 1920s. So did Zimbabwe. And today, our world still walks the same fragile path, pretending value can be printed forever. History doesn't repeat, but it rhymes with terrifying precision. The real fall of Rome wasn't about armies. It was about money. And that lesson, if we ignore it, will come for us too. If this gave you a new perspective, hit subscribe. History has the answers. You just have to listen.